So, a little bit of coffee and sense making. I'm recording thoughts after we did our very first session of community sense making for this What the Heck's Going On in Tech thing. So, let's see, we can edit that out. We're going to go, good morning, coffee and sense making. I'm recording my thoughts after the very first What the Heck's Going On in Tech sense making session with the community. So I did the first open session where we read through some of the responses, looked at things, and thought about what might be next. So this is a survey that I put out in October in collaboration with my partner Carissa and John Cutler. And we were trying to figure out like what is going on in tech and how could we think about the way that it's operating and what sort of what are the vibes that are going on? What's surprising? What are we missing? And then what could we do about it? So the point of this type of sense making that we're doing now is how do we understand the world better so that we can act in it? And that's really what it is. It's not a sort of purely theoretical exercise. We're not going to get to firm answers that this is why it is, this is what's happening, and there's nothing you can do about it. We want to move away from that sort of sense of things, and that will become a theme throughout the whole process. So there may be a hook in here for the report and everything, which is so what can we do? We're in this position where a lot of people feel a lack of agency in their roles and in the system that we've built. And yet we all agree that the system is built by people and we're people. So what can we do? How can we, the little people, reclaim our agency and take charge of our own lives and that sort of thing? So thinking about some other thoughts there, important things to do. Yeah, what in terms of decentralization, nodes, MySpace, etc., what from an older era could inspire us for the next version of our industry? How can we, the little people, reclaim our sovereignty? So, another thought for a kind of intro or a theme for this is as we read through these stories, as we see these themes, it is what it is, and a lot of it sucks. So, I've had people telling me that they really struggled emotionally with reading this. It becomes quite depressing, quite stressful, distressing, perhaps distressing and depressing. And yet, we've had examples from the past of commons and of groups of people acting together to to change systems and not to be trapped by them. The internet as a commons and people's skills and expertise as a sort of commons. How do we shift the dial then from the way things are to in control? Um, so yeah, for another tiny thing to say is that this very first session we did was really just a taster of a sense making session. So it takes longer than an hour to get through this sort of stuff. We just had an hour together, but the input from the group helps to guide things and direct the report in general. So let's zoom back out. We're going to say this is what we did to begin with was we had these four groups of stories. So we had positive leaning stories, and this is stuff that was signified by the people who gave the stories. So first, let's look at this collector again. So we're asking for a story in this way. Your best friend, this is called a non-hypothesis prompt. And that's really important when you're doing something like SenseMaker. We're not trying to check whether our hypothesis is right. We are hiding any hypotheses that we have and making this very open. So we're not trying to direct you to a particular answer or frame it in a particular, frame it with our beliefs as a particular sort of push for it. This is just trying to be as open as possible and just tell us what things are like. Your best friend asks you how things are going for you professionally. You tell them about an experience you've had over the past few weeks that sums up what things feel like for you at the moment. Please write what you say to your friend. And then people write it in. And then there's a few different triangles and they're called triads and dyads, which people could choose to assess their story for themselves. This is signifying what it means. In my story, the situation was shaped by, and it's a balance between processes or procedures, tools, equipment, or technology, and people, skills, behaviors, or relationships. In my story, my choices were driven by, and there's a mixture here of potentially pragmatism, idealism, and skepticism. And these are all valid standpoints to take. So we're not trying to say good and bad, we're saying a balance between equally good things, equally reasonable things. And in my story, the choices of others were influenced by risk, compliance, or people. These are all reasonable things as well. Then we get this question. So the overall vibe of my story is very positive, positive, neutral, negative, or very negative. We can look at the skew of these later. But yeah, generally, the stories leaned very negative, and we got a lot of negative skew. So as we go in, that's where we got these from. So we're then able to spit out all of the positive leaning stories, all of the neutral stories, all of the negative, and there were so many negatives, put them in two different chunks. And then we divided the group that joined the session up into four subgroups, and each subgroup went in and started reading through these entries and then spotting themes, which they then collected together. So we've got some stickies all lying around here. We can see things like, what have we got here? Sense narrative, similar, many changes, learning and unlearning. So one of the prompts that we used was what is similar to how you feel, what's different from how you feel, what's surprising, which is a classic complexity, complex facilitation framing. So if we read through the positive stories, what we can see is a cluster where collaboration is becoming harder. Tools claim they make our lives easier, but do they? Tools are better, the hype is worse. Teams looking to script straight to the flashy stuff, so there's a theme of more technology overall. There's a new role of builder with decreasing cycle times, less time spent on basic outputs and more on architecture and strategy. Interesting. It's a survival experience. So one thing that people noted here in the positive valence stories was how not positive they were still. And we got this sense here of swimming in polluted water, finding our way by trial and error. So the positive people are swimming, but it's still not nice. There's a theme of people leaving big tech and moving into much more working solo, people looking for funding. And there's a sense that command and control is failing, understanding that enterprise is not a startup. Engineering gets the blame, product is safe, is another theme that was interesting. Someone talking about hiring only people over 50, which is interesting. Mixture of dot-com euphoria and 2007 recession. That's a really interesting spot. These two fighting things. I think interesting to note, perhaps from I vaguely remember the dot-com boom and bust. So the dot-com euphoria was very exciting, and then it was followed by a big crash, and it was also a time of great uncertainty when a lot of ideas were forming and then failed. Like famously, I think pets.com was one, but there are several like really high-profile ideas which would be done later by other companies successfully, but which the dot-com boom, just the world wasn't ready for them. And I've heard from someone else who was around then that this current time with generative AI tools feels really similar to that dot-com boom and then bust. We've got this, so and that links with this idea of uncertainty about the future and the idea of the future of work in the field is at risk due to AI. Like we don't know what it's going to be. But there's an optimism that pointless work will disappear in the future. Then there's a sense from some people that people are more open to learn about what design and research are doing, and some people are experiencing their first time in a cross-functional team, which, if you're into that sort of work, it's really exciting. It's good. Tight budgets, etc., but the job is fun, and there's more work than people to do it. So that's a theme that we're seeing in a lot of places, and I've heard that there are CEOs who are putting hiring bans on or hiring freezes down because they want to force people to figure out how to do more with less. Um, they want to force people to experiment with this generative AI stuff to see how can we do more with fewer people. And there's this then theme here of, oh, we've gone round and found more themes here. Everyone reassessing what their goals are. We're unclear what the job expectation is and how performance is measured. So this ties again to this uncertainty about what is our job now? What are we actually doing? And there's a sense of progressing and impact, but also stress, which links to this tight budgets. But things are picking up and there's some momentum. And the second generation of products after add a chatbot to everything is more impactful. So there's some, yeah, what we're seeing here, I think it feels like to me we've got the sort of potential shoots of something new happening, which is different from the feeling of losing the stuff that we've got. And yet they're also saying, yeah, the new shoots are growing in a wasteland. It's We're swimming in polluted water. We've figured out how to start being able to swim, but everything is still a mess. So it's not overwhelmingly positive, as people said. There's this sense, oh yeah, these are copied up there now. Good. So we got, yeah, there is really this theme of the old way that things working is failing, and a shift to, which is not really surprising, a shift to, I suppose, smaller teams are able to do more with the support of this generative AI type stuff. So positive, that's the positive. We zoom over and look at the neutral. I remember one of the participants saying the neutral just felt pretty negative as well, actually. But so I wonder if they wondered, I think, if this was more a sense of acceptance than it was actually neutral. So we're seeing there, what are some things here? Oh yeah, piloting planes and figuring out how to fly along the way, which I suppose was ever thus. Unexpectedness, uncertainty, change. There's issues with focus. Things are moving around a lot. Things are okay, but also not okay. Um, there's this theme of quiet quitting, which seems to have come out from the neutral stories. Meanwhile, unrelenting pressures and a Sisyphean sort of sense to things. You're always pushing the boulder up the hill and it's rolling back down again. And this ties, I suppose, with burnout. So the neutral then is this, it seems like a sort of retreat. You're not maybe moving away from being upset about things being this way into a state of, as I said, acceptance. And the feeling that, yeah, if you're not quiet quitting and you're trying to deal with the pressures, you end up with wasted or excessive efforts where you've got, I suppose, this thing of the focus shifting and moving around a lot. That links to people that I know and stuff that I've heard about how the vision is constantly changing, the strategy is constantly changing because people are worried about the future and just don't know what's going to happen. A lack of faith in leadership is right in there, which I suppose ties back to this idea that command and control is failing. There's this world where command and control would work with these, tech sort of technocratic feudal lords who would put their dent in the universe, who would, decide on a vision and then have the funding to push through and do it and stick to their vision. And now that seems to be much more difficult for leaders to do. The funding is not really available. The future, the uncertainty about the future has really hit. And this could be a combination of the hangover from the pandemic as well, which had a few effects. One was to really hammer home how everything could change. There's huge uncertainty. Then the trends that started during the pandemic of massive onlineness then suddenly reversed, stopped, and we went back to the previous trend line. And that was a shock for many companies who then had to reassess, readjust, often with layoffs, often with budget cuts, that sort of thing, and false promises on hiring because you were hiring for a world that then turned out not to happen a lot faster than you expected. We've got themes of AI popping up, which is unsurprising as it's, big news. It solves some problems, surface level, but not deep. Surprising is, I suppose, someone noted that a lot of people are experiencing similar things. And that's been a theme from a lot of people I've heard from who've read through this is, wow, I'm not alone. And that is maybe a hook for this whole piece that we're going to make is a kind of you're not alone. It's not just you. Like this is we're in this transition, and here's what it means for you, which I presume is right. Similar here, there's something about like generalists, I suppose, and there's a question here of as we shift from knowing what to do with specialists in the systems that we've had in the 2010s, particularly, it sort of developed a way that a lot of companies worked. That's changing, the roles are shifting, and there's now perhaps a need for generalists who can do more different things together. Right, let's zoom in and look at some of the negative now. This is the first chunk of negatives. Oh, an interesting question here that somebody points out. Later entries mention AI more than earlier entries do. And maybe what's happened is we happened to release this collector some sort of inflection point for AI. We collected most of the stories in October in 2024, and this was very much a snapshot of that period of time. So a note for us as well. One thing we want to do is rerun this study again, same collector, but collect another chunk of data from a different time period with another push to get it in front of people based off perhaps sharing a first initial report. And yeah, it's interesting to think how to frame that well um, to get this other report to come through and hit in the right way. So we've got here thoughts of, I'm just going to check my timings. Yeah, cool. Yeah, good. Uh, yeah, so the idea of running another round of the collector, it feels to me like we should be providing some value from this first. But if we tell people what we're seeing, etc., and the thoughts from this collector, that is going to then skew what we get in the next collector. So there's an interesting challenge there because you kind of want to not know what's going on. But I think we might have to just lean into the fact that that is what we're doing and be straightforward about it. And I think, yeah, we do. I'm keen to share something from here pretty soon and try and get a relatively short but punchy thing out with the top level ideas. And that's what we're going to be looking at next. So here we're in the negatives here, and we've got a sense of AI leading to poor quality and aversion to AI. So this ties in with that idea of like resistance, I suppose. There's a resistance when you're feeling negative, pushing against something that is happening. And there's this theme of reverting to traditional management strategies but calling it agile. I've seen this retrenchment into an older school of management in the world where it's confusing for the execs as well, and they're trying to regain control. This leads to corporate chaos with reorganizations. There's confusion, discouragement. Feels like chasing cats. Feels like theatre was a big theme that seemed to come out. Lots of unqualified newbies and management and executives who are unfamiliar with the topic. So they're not delivering value. It's not results driven, and it leads to exploitation of individuals and society. Calls to unionize, amid a ruined civilization, catastrophic, relentless extraction, and climate emergency. There's a whole theme here of which you could sort of drive. I can see how they all sort of go together. There's this sense of exploitation, climate emergency, these bigger themes going on, catastrophic, extractive type capitalism society. And then within that world, the companies are playing a game that doesn't match up with what they said they're doing. And this creates this difficult thing. And it's interesting aging out at 50 plus, seeing that as a counterpoint to the positive stories where there was almost a deliberate hiring of people over 50, which was interesting. And I wonder if that was in a theoretical future, actually. If we read through the stories, you can see that there's a what would you tell about the past few weeks? There's also a metaphor and there's also a thought for the future. But we've got within this themes of ageism and struggles finding a job and layoffs and offshoring. Competition is increased within the roles that are available, and there's a theme of leaving tech altogether. And there's uh, Debbie Levitt's written a book about it, leaving tech, and that's a theme that a lot of people have done. And there's people I know, high profile designers who are leaving the world of design for tech. This theme of bad hiring methods, bad quality hires, relates to this sense of people being unqualified. I wonder again, now I'm thinking about this, is this the natural thing as things shift? Did we actually see? It'd be interesting to look back at the dot-com boom and bust and see was there a similar sense going on at the time of the dot-com crash where we were now shifting into a new model, a new way of working for businesses, and the people who made it work during the dot-com boom perhaps saw that what we had and that the right ways to do things were being lost in favor of this new way that was never going to work, and then created an enormous boom. Also, this sense of sexism and ageism, which is yeah, very very tough to deal with, and we're looking at it's kind of themes of bad hiring, like leaving out people who are good at stuff in order to hire people who are not, but are good at something else, maybe good at the high level competition, perhaps. And there's a sense that we'll figure it out by 2034, which sounds like a long time away. And then I think these are from some of the metaphors. So there's a sense of a jackhammer, the noise of that, cold water on your head while your feet are on fire, and a sense of drowning. Okay, let's zoom on to the negative pile number two. So this is a different group, but reading the stories that also have a negative valence. And they're seeing a sense of urgency in all of this. So interestingly, someone saw there's a different thing that people were being actively discouraged and confused and losing hope. Extreme negativity, narrow focus, a political view, and a very specific use case shared, a hopeful pessimist. So some thoughts here going down. We've got predictable but undesirable behavior is an interesting theme. I like that one. There's a feeling that what's happening is predictable but undesirable, which gets to this sense again of lack of control. It's behaviors that I can't control or influence. It's predictable. It's undesirable. We don't want it, but we don't seem to be able to change that. Solutions that served me in the past no longer serve me. It feels like screaming into the void, which I suppose, yeah, the behavior is predictable but undesirable. You're saying we don't want that, but it's happening anyway. Support structure is a barrier, is interesting, and patterns of the past became the chaos of the present. That sort of, I suppose, links with something I was just saying, where the way that things were working, that seemed to work well, now there's been some sort of shift and it's not working anymore. And there feels like then there's this theme of there's either a retrenchment and a pull back to older ways of working. You say, well, if our ways of working aren't working anymore, let's go back in time and try something more controlling or more old school. Whereas then there's this flip side from the positive stories of people starting to learn new ways of working that they feel are more hopeful. And we're back to this idea of swimming in polluted water, swimming through sludge, um, which makes me think of themes as well of like the AI slop that is now a big sort of metaphor that we've got for what's happening. Completely bungled org restructure. So we've seen themes already of org restructuring with no structure to rely on, confusion, no control. Riding the world's most boring roller coaster is a that's a punchy metaphor. I think that one we've got to pull out as something. I mean, that's a title for the report, isn't it? Mired in tech debt, disestablished, slogging away. My job is boring right now, but I'm basically stuck there. And this sort of feels like all of this swimming through sludge is kind of in there. We're mired. I'm stuck in this sludge, stuck in the muck, slogging away, slogging through that. An endless scroll of LinkedIn status updates. Oof. Okay, we've got this sense of so that's one chunk which is all about being mired and bored and stuck and on riding the world's most boring roller coaster. We've got another theme here. These themes are getting more interesting than the first chunk from this, where we've got trail of broken promises, which I think again comes back to this sense of leadership are failing us in this new world. There's no investment into anything, feeling devalued with no place in this new normal. There's dissonance and disconnect, thrashing, and budgets are tight everywhere. Like we've seen that. That's across the board. We've seen this tighter budgets. There's a sense of burnout. Another chunk here, futility and burnout, with no end in sight, frustration and a dire outlook, downward spiral into a death march, stretched out like perilous elastic, and soul-crushing meetings. So there's this sense of precarity there, and there trauma, distrust, and expecting the next shoe to drop. So it's bad, and we're slogging away and surviving, feeling devalued, and just waiting for it to get worse. I think seems to be the theme. So that's super negative right there. Okay, what we did from here was having looked through some of these themes or done these themes together, we then jumped over and looked at some graphs, and these we could get into the report in some way. And we've got a sense here of how these stories are clustered. And what I wanted to illustrate was something Jules pointed out that's interesting, is this sense of lack of agency being perhaps the biggest part of the suffering. And so on this, in my story, the way things played out was either in my control or out of my control. We see a massive skew towards out of my control. Like almost everybody is in that top blob there, 100% out of my control. I can't do anything about this. And my story represents either a one-off event or the way things are, or somewhere in between. And there's a huge, again, skew towards this is just the way things are. And in my story, and yet the thing that I think is interesting is within this, the way things are, there's a huge variation. So you tend to think that your local experience is how it is everywhere, seems to be the story that we've got. And yet that is not the case. And that is where it becomes interesting as we get into the next section to look at, well, how could we pull out the stories from where people don't feel like that, where people do have a sense of agency? What do we see in those stories as opposed to the fully out of my control stories? And then the other thing that's worth noting is in my story, the situation was shaped by, and in my story, the choices of others were influenced by, there is a big skew again towards people, We've got people, skills, behaviors, relationships, people. People are what's happening here. And if it's people, then you are people as well. And so you do have some control, some agency. You have the ability to change your behaviors, your relationships, etc. So there's an interesting tension there where if you feel like you've got no agency, then of course you are stuck. And then if we think about the individuals and how they are choosing to act, there seems to be a lean towards pragmatism with a balance, perhaps. There's this sort of, I'm seeing a line forming in the middle here where it's a tension between idealism and skepticism, and a sense that, which we can read from the stories as well, actually, a sense that we've lost a lot of the idealism that we had about tech. And now we're deeply skeptical about the goals of the leaders and the way that things are working, the sense of extraction, this ignoring of the climate crisis. And yet that's not universal. There are companies who are not in that extractive world. And yet in tech, it feels very much like that potentially. So we see, here's something I mentioned earlier, where we've got this sense of the way things are, that there's a heavy skew towards this, but the way things are is very variable, from ranging from energizing to exhausting. And a lot of people, there's a big cluster in exhausting and the way things are, but we can see a little cluster over here where actually it's more energizing. And so there's an interesting question for us to consider as we move on, which is, can we look at whether we could consider more stories like these and fewer stories like those? How could we make that happen? How could we help people not to suddenly be energized, but to move to feeling that this is not just the way things are, and it is less exhausting? And maybe then we can move and sort of strengthen this other cluster here. Or maybe there's a sense of a cluster here. Maybe we can move to this little chunk here. So we're still feeling this is the way things are, but at least we're moving towards, towards a slightly more energizing cluster. There's this other cluster here where there's people who are really stuck in this deep, dark hole. Well, is there a way to move those people into here? Could we look at more stories like these and fewer like those? Because this is better than that. And so these are some interesting ones to pull out. For another one, in the way things are, this is about communication and what was the communication style. And here we have a sense that communication was oblique and indirect, or it was transparent and direct, transparent or direct. And for the people experiencing it, they feel that's just the way things are. Yet there's these other clusters where people see it as a one-off event. So it'd be interesting to consider, could we shift, like what about more stories like these, fewer like those? So we're seeing less that our experience is universal and starting to understand that perhaps there is more variety here. I'm not sure there's a better sense within this. I think really just shifting people out of this is just the way things are, into having more of a sense of agency and a more a sense that there are other things out there. It's not just this for everyone. And yet you're also not alone. You're not alone, perhaps, in seeing that this is the way things are. Perhaps there's a sense of comparing between these two chunks and showing the people who think that the way things are is transparent and direct is different from the way things are is oblique and indirect, and both exist. And that's okay. I don't know. And then the big question we had here was around this. So in my story, the way things played out was in my control or out of my control. We've seen that again. So out of my control, there's a big cluster here. And for me, things feel like they're getting worse to getting better. And there's a cluster down here of things getting worse. And so one question would be, I think we're seeing perhaps another, that this lump here suggests a sort of smallish, the hint of a cluster. Is there something we can do here? Now, one thing that's perhaps a bit distressing on this graph is that there really isn't another cluster. This is the strongest one. And maybe that's a sense of just not enough data. But we can see a lot of people stuck on this line here. So I wonder if the first thing, again, like another thing, is just to take some of these really distressing stories here and think about how could we move to something that is slightly less brutal. And then as we look through here, things, can we shift that further? Is there another way to move to another cluster somewhere out there? So we started to ask that question. That was the next thing we did in the session. And people started writing down different ideas for what we might do. And we've got this big picture stuff like address climate impacts. And we've got a sense here of unionization, organizing collectives and bargaining unions, and a potential for universal income, which was sort of related, but I think it's slightly different from unionization. I think there's a sense here of we, the little people. So bringing this back, this is a question of how can we, the little people, reclaim our sovereignty? I think was the major question we asked here. Yeah, got that. And so yeah, there's this sense here of potentially unionization, and it's these relationships. This has happened before, and people have shifted things and moved to change things. There's this sense of the system influences behavior, but we are the system. Can you understand your own level of control and influence? And perhaps it's more than you think. Is this about changing your own perspective? Focus on things you can control. Can you see problems as opportunities for creative tension? We've got a sense here, I think, of moving to the individual and looking at what each of us can do differently. We can change what we expect from work. There's a sense of do we have acceptance to change our own perspective and look at what we can control and understand what our agency really is. Can we escape the feeling of being dragged along hopelessly by anchoring on enduring values? Can we stop looking for perfect or the supposed way, the right way to do things, and take action that's a little bit messier? Can we acknowledge some often painful or embarrassing realities of context? Can we start by reassessing what really matters to me, which is this sense of changing what we expect, anchor on enduring values, which is reassessing what really matters, and stop looking for perfect or the supposed way. Some of this, it has a feeling of cope. How do you do the individual thing to keep yourself okay? And there's another tool here differentiating between what you're told, what you believe, what you can do, and what's possible. And a big sense here of disrupting your own routines, disrupting what's going on. There was a chunk in the middle talking about, well, wow, the way things are. So this group of people who think this is just the way things are, that is system justification bias. It is a human aspect. It's a human nature thing. Our very adaptability, the thing that gives us power and agency, can also lead to apathy because we can adapt to a situation that's getting worse and worse. Someone says, why do we stay in less than ideal situations? This happens outside of work too. So there's an interesting theme to dig into there. Maybe this is part of being human, and I wondered how might we provoke people out of this? When do you get to that, a point when you do shift and you change your perspective? And what might the action might look like? Well, it is testing the waters with small steps. Understand how you create value and why. Start your own thing. Just leave tech. These are ways to go. Which again, I think it also means understanding and reframing your own value. And I think I can say from having been on that journey for a couple of years, it's not easy, and it's yeah, not easy. It's quite stressful, but it seems like it's probably better than the negative stories that the world are being trapped and just swimming in polluted water. I don't know. There's still always the sense of maybe you'll be drowning, um, but at least it's I don't know. At least it's on your own terms. Is that better? Um, so then, the other extreme from the individual sort of chunk, we've got a sense of the grouping and the let's work together. So moving through this idea of unionization and collective bargaining, well, how about we exploit the contagion effect of how we show up? So if we show up differently, perhaps that shifts things for other people. Can we redesign the incentives? We can understand that momentum has a shelf life, and so we need to build systems that build continuous momentum, respect the pause and curiosity, and reward curiosity. Sort of redesigning the incentives. How could we shape our own environment, I suppose, so that it was like that, and thus would have a contagion effect to others? I think that's what that story is getting into. Can we focus on direct relationships, um, and create networks that validate these issues and leverage potential? So we're finding others with similar values to work with, rather than whatever's happening at the moment. But that's the intention, I suppose, with using language that other people or roles understand. If we're not working with others who are similar to us, then we need to understand the drivers and incentives of the people around us. And so, do we need a deeper training on personal skills over technical? Which is interesting. I think that there is definitely a shift that I've observed in my career, and possibly that works across many people, which is, yeah, letting go of a lot of the technical stuff and moving much more into understanding how do you influence people. And I'm thinking of, well, Scott Berkhan's book, What Makes Design Hard, is very timely. And that, I think, comes to similar sorts of themes. There's a sense of you can acceptance, like you're not going to change some systems. Maybe that's okay. Or if you want to change the system, there are really two routes, and that's power or influence. And power is you need to play the power game, become a power broker so that you can rise up the ranks and then change, redesign the incentives and build systems that reward what you think they should reward that will be better and healthier. Or with influence, you are, again, it's building relationships, finding people with similar values to you, creating networks of those, but then also understanding the people who don't have similar values to you and using the right language, using language that they will understand rather than your language. And this is much more about personal and political skills over technical. And this is all hard, so perhaps we need group therapy for product tech and design, which is an interesting thought that could be done. How do we create, again, communities or networks where people can help each other more? And how can we create those without them? The thing that immediately it just pops into my head is, well, there are some communities that attempt to do that, and yet they're often captured, or end up being run by people who are not particularly wonderful themselves. Um, you know, there's some high profile troubled situations there where when we look into like therapy, mentoring, that sort of thing, certainly within design, how do we move to some sort of community that isn't one of those? Is there a collective, do we put together like a small collective of people who have these similar values about growing something that is going to be adaptable, that is going to work with what's coming, be able to test the waters with small steps, understand how we create value, and try doing that differently. And recognize when our biases, like negativity and confirmation, are at play. And notice that sometimes we are oblivious to ignoring positive things. This sort of brings back, this ties together the similar values with how do we interrupt ourselves and shift how we work and disrupt our routines is one thing here. Then there are some questions here of will new companies simply emerge that topple the big giants? Um, and there's a direct line from company offering to value. Not quite sure what that means. But one of the discussions that happened during the session was there is kind of a seasonal thing. There's this cycle where when times get tough, and this happened last in the early 90s, I believe, companies just get rid of the people who are never going to make it to the top ranks. So if you're not a political operator, you suddenly find there's nowhere for you in the company that you've been working at. And it's a chance for, I suppose, the company to do that retrenchment and to solidify this is they are taking their own action to say, well, we're finding the people with similar values that we want to work with, and we're going to eject the others, reducing, I suppose, the risk is they're reducing the diversity of people there, becoming more homogeneous, which makes them in turn more fragile. Maybe that's how these tech giants are going to get toppled. Okay, so lots of interesting themes there, which are about what could we do? What could we do to help us shift and regain a sense of agency and help we, the little people, to gain a sense of sovereignty? And then we finished with three questions, three final prompts for people. So, one thing you're considering doing, a question that you'd like to consider in the next session, and what would you change about the session we just did? So, one thing you're considering doing is driving more value connections in my next company to the work that is being done. And that's very close to my heart. That's, I think, the goal of multiverse mapping generally is to show how our success depends on the work that is being done. And the value is created by the things that we do, but also by the choice about what we don't do. Someone else is considering keep pushing the dialogue on the human/relational aspect of engineering. Nice. Someone else still thinking about leaving tech. Nice. Someone else saying that they want to understand the tech industry history from before I was born and what we can learn from it. That's an interesting one that came up earlier as well. Is this just a pattern that we have seen before? And what sort of themes can we learn from that? Is that just in the dot-com boom bust, or are there earlier patterns that are really similar? I think there are cycles that seem to happen in these roughly like 10 to 20 year phases. One that I think of is this idea of first it's a world of protocols and enabling stuff to happen, and then it becomes a world of user experience and making the things that can now be done easier to use and more understandable. But there are lots of other ways of looking at this. Someone else says doubling down on my value thesis is the next thing they're going to do. Someone else address more in conversations the feeling. So I guess, when they're in conversations, just have more of this feeling. And then someone else considering doing my own thing. And this, yeah, there's an interesting sense of this tension, I think, between if you're doing your own thing, is that then creating a sort of a lighted path forward for others, where you get that contagion effect? Or are you doing your own thing in terms of opting out of the system and becoming invisible? And that's an interesting tension. If you want to shift the system, is doing your own thing the way to do it? Or how do you do your own thing in relation to others? A question to consider next time. So these were some questions people had. How do we help people find ways to navigate all of this? That's interesting. Someone's wondering, what is the wider societal situation, e.g. the meta crisis? And there's many, many names for this, meta crisis, polycrisis, etc., etc. Someone wondering, are why you work and how you are rewarded connected? Or is that an issue? Someone else wondering, why are expectations not being met? Who's setting the expectations for how work should be? Where do these expectations come from? That's an interesting question. Why are so many of the themes we saw about this isn't what I signed up for kind of thing? What were we told, and why is it not that? Another question, are most answers, even in the what would you tell a friend, guided by looking into the future? We've got this sense of hope versus fear. What is the fundamental divide between people who feel agentic and those who don't? And that's a really important question. That ties to some of the themes we saw in the maps. And um, two ways to go about this, like can we see what makes them different? Can we see sort of themes in that by reading those different stories and looking at some of the maps when we boil down to let's look at just the people who feel agentic and just the people who don't. What are we seeing differently in the stories? But then moving, actually, you don't necessarily need to understand the divide or have a theory of it in order to say, how could we get more stories like these and fewer like those? That it might be a case of we're going to need to define actions or probes that will that we can try, which will then in turn reveal the answer to this question. Another question that came up, so another question to consider next time, how to solicit stories from people who are genuinely happy. And what is it about their story that is different? And this is something that came up. There is almost certainly a bias in this data set towards people who A have the time to complete a survey and B feel like they have something to say about tech right now. And they're probably the people who are disenfranchised. And there's another cohort of people who've already left tech, who are therefore not considering themselves within this data set, who could shed light on it as well. Like this is necessarily biased in data collection, as every survey is. You cannot collect a perfect sample. The question is, what are the things you're going to do with the sample you've got? And I think one of the things I'd say about SenseMaker is it is not trying to create a representative sample in order for you to do analytical work on it. It's very much about narrative tropes and about highlighting the narrative assemblages or attractors within a system through stories that a lot of people are telling and clusters of these stories. So I'm not so worried about the bias in this, but it's an interesting question. Can we can we hear from some people who are genuinely happy? Then how can we separate the individual changes, the company changes, and the systemic changes? Well, that's a really interesting question, and that ties to some of the themes that we saw in the ideas for what we're going to do. There's some stuff we're going to do as individuals, stuff that we need to do as collectives, stuff we need to do to influence companies, perhaps. But companies exist within a larger system. Um, that they are just trying to survive as well. So, next question: can we understand the breakdown of these answers by class and other demographics? Class is an interesting one. I don't think we collected any data about that. And yeah, that's. I wonder if that was a Brit who shared that because class is a sort of more British concept than American, I suppose. Although clearly class exists in many cultures under different names. So, final question: how can we connect with other industries and even non-tech roles in our companies? Opportunities for solidarity. That's an interesting one. Is it time that tech sort of grew up and professionalized? Is a question that's been asked a lot. Do we need to settle down the Wild West that we've had now and be more boring and like other professional services? Okay. Finally, then, what would you change about the session? And someone's wondering, maybe a two-part where you can just read and then just make sense, which is interesting. Yeah. Everybody reads color coding of stickies, themes over multiple sentiments. So someone looking for, I suppose, a little bit more structure in how we made sense between the different stickies. Yeah, I was very clear at the start. This is the first time I've done something like this with this data set and at this scale and with people that I'm not working with, where we kind of have a shared professional goal. This is very much just open and early stage, so it was difficult to be able to design a very clear structure for it. But I'd say from that perspective, it was very exciting to see. It was interesting for me to see how this developed and how well it actually worked, despite it being highly uncertain for me. Big shout out to Jules from Canevin Company, who really helped to structure some of the like to keep it simple. So I think I was probably overthinking it when I was planning the session, and actually just having this reading and theming started the conversation so well. An interesting thought here, though, if you can share the findings in advance with some prompts, we can be more ready for the exercise. Yep, that's an interesting one. I think there's something about doing it live in the session, but I know some people would rather read and think and come with thoughts fully formed. Although that's slightly different from the spirit of what we're trying to do. Someone else says, as a researcher, I'd run it like this, so not so much, not much to change. And then someone else would like more clarity about when it's open discussion versus facilitated, and would love to hear more from people who did not get to talk. Which is fair. There were a few voices who did stick out more than others, which is always a challenge. I would like to, I think, to solve that, I would like to have people jumping back into the small groups again to have some of these discussions because you can have them with a smaller group where you can't with the big group together. Someone else, there was a tension between extend the time, so we've got longer to do stuff, more time, but also people saying 1 hour works well because any longer can get tiring. So perhaps more focus on fewer topics. And there seems to be a divide between wanting open discussion versus facilitated activities, but it's hard to feel like there's enough time to do both well in 1 hour. And so where I'm thinking is, there was some notes afterwards that were really good, and there was something, so some other themes that I wanted to capture now. One of which was, should we look at the difference between the larger companies and the smaller companies and the self-employed? So we've captured that in the data, and if I pull those divides out and look at what some of the stories are and how those sentiments break down, do we see something there? And I'm thinking about designing separate sessions to dig into some of these separate questions. There was a note from Troy, which was great, about there was a college drinking intervention in America that actually worked to reduce college drinking. And the brilliance of the intervention was they just said what was actually happening already. So when they went in and measured the amount of drinking that was actually happening, they found it was a lot lower than people were afraid. And actually, most people drank extremely moderately, and then a handful of people were going off the rails. So what they did was then release a report that said, you know what, most people drink very moderately. They only have this much. And the result of that was you created this normalization. And so now it was okay. Everybody was now seeing that the norm was a lower amount of drinking, and everybody drank less, which is interesting. Then somebody said that they would like to see some sort of a draft, a light way of engaging with this to show you're not alone, and and be able to share something along those lines. I think to see, look, it is normal. You what you're experiencing is normal, and it's okay, and it's not as bad as you think. And I think some of that is there, and you have. I wonder if that's the thing. You have agency. You already have these things you can do. Maybe the draft study includes those sorts of suggestions of stuff you could literally do tangibly. Which brings me to the main thing that I would like to do next, which is a session where we really do pull out this sense of who feels the sense of agency and who doesn't, and then can we get to some like what could people do? How could we get more stories like these and fewer like those, in very tangible ways? That's I think that's when it gets really exciting. Um, so maybe that's the next bit before a report, I would say. Then within all of this, there's a lot of circling around I think, and that was another point that somebody made from the college drinking intervention thing, is at the moment the hype is huge and people saying they're doing everything with AI, and we don't think that's true. We don't think it is quite as prevalent, quite as powerful as maybe some people are saying. So that's, yeah, an interesting challenge to what's otherwise a sort of obvious thing that should be happening. Maybe if we just let everybody know, actually, it's normal to be using it only a little bit and to be using it only for these things and not for these things, and maybe that's enough to tell people actually you're okay. You don't need to worry about this so much. And I wondered about sharing a link in an email that I would send to people as a thank you afterwards, which was the sense of the semantic apocalypse, which was looking at the Ghibli uh, phenomenon and how that removes meaning from stuff that was previously meaningful. What's that going to shift for us in general? Great. So that's the overall uh, picture of this. I've spent a bunch of time recording my screen and recording my thoughts. So the next step is take that and I think compress it and start to think about what could a little draft report be off the back of that. So I don't know if I've published this as is or if this is going to be something written, but thank you for your time and attention.